a 22mm socket, let's remove all these caps that hold on the center cap for your lug nuts. Set this aside, and then with a 22mm socket as well, go ahead and remove all 8 of your lug nuts, and then we'll remove the wheel. Before we go further, I'm going to take a pry bar, stick it in here, and just try to compress the pistons of the caliper a little bit. That'll make it easier to take this off. With a 17mm socket, I'm going to remove the 2 bolts that hold the caliper onto the bracket. Get this top one off first. And with these off, take your caliper, slide it off of the caliper bracket and the pads. Set it on top of the leaf spring so it doesn't put any pressure on your brake hose. Now you can remove the pads, just slide them out of the bracket. This one's a little bit stuck, so I'm going to use a pry bar. There we go. Now with an 18mm socket, I want to remove these 2 bolts that mount the bracket onto the knuckle. So I'm going to do this one with my air gun, but this one, obviously I can't fit anything but a hand tool in there, so. I'm going to go ahead and take this one out first, but I will leave it in a few threads. That way I can hold the bracket in while I take off the top. Go ahead and break this free. Helps if you have a long ratchet or a breaker bar that you can get in here. You can either use a ratcheting wrench, a regular wrench, or a 3/8 drive ratchet. Usually it'll fit in here, and you can take the bolt all the way out. Once you get it loose enough, you can do this by hand. Just make sure you don't get your tool stuck in between here. That's not going to be fun. Take the bracket off, take your rotor off. The next thing I want to do is spray some brake parts cleaner all over to get rid of all the dust, brake dust and debris, sand, anything that might be here, so I can have a nice clean working area, including, and obviously including back here by the parking brake shoes, because these collect a lot of dust over time. Next, I'm going to pull the axle with these 19mm bolts. Once you remove those, the axle comes out, and then we can move the hub away, and then we can do our job. So, like I said, 19mm socket, remove all of these. There we go. Mine had a bunch of gasket maker on them, so I'm just going to remove all of that, make sure the threads are nice and clean for installation. I'm going to tap this with a hammer to hopefully break it free. There we go. Gear oil will come out, so I have a drain pan underneath. Slowly and gently remove the axle, support it so that you don't ruin any seals. Okay. Gonna use a brand new razor blade to scrape things off. course, try to scrape towards the outside, not the inside. Scrape away any debris that might have got in here. Now we have to remove this large nut that's in here. You can see, but it's locked in with a C-clip. So with a large pick, I'm gonna try to, but it's locked in with a little snap ring, lock ring thing. So I'm just gonna take a pick and try to pick this out of here. There we go. With a magnet, go ahead and pull this locking pin out that sits here at the top. And then I'm going to count the threads to know how many threads in this ring was so that I can put it back exactly the way it was before. I had 5, hang on. I have 5 visible threads here, so that's what I'm going to go by. And I'm actually going to mark the ring right here so that I know this is the top. I'm going to use a permanent marker and just make a line right here. And that way I know that this is the top facing towards the outside. So with my pick, I'm going to go ahead and just back this off. There it is. Now grab your hub assembly and wiggle it. Now that this is loose with a pry bar, go ahead and pry this off. There we go. Remove your hub assembly with the bearings. Here's our broken lug stud. We can now hammer this off of here. There it is. Take the new one, slide it up and through, and I'm actually going to flip this upside down just so I can get it started. I'm going to give it a couple whacks with the hammer. All right, now that it's started, flip it back the right way. Now if you don't have a lug nut installer tool, you can take an axle nut. I put a little bit of grease on the bottom so it can slide around easier if it wants to. A little bit of grease on the threads, which we will clean up after. You don't want to leave this grease on here. That way, and I have an old lug nut. I always suggest buying a new lug nut with a new stud and use the old lug nut to install it. If you have a press, a hydraulic press, you can press this in. Which I do have, but I want to show it to you this way in case you don't have anything other than an air gun and your stud. So with my 22mm socket, I'm going to go ahead and snug this up, keep tightening it until this gets sucked through completely. Gonna add a little bit of grease here. A little bit on here. All right, let's try this axle nut. That's it. I put a tiny bit of AntiSeize on the bottom there, and you saw it come out. That's how I know that it is fully installed. Either way, no matter what you do or how you do it, you do want to double check these several times after the wheel has been mounted, and you drive around a little bit, maybe a day or two, retorque this one, another week or so, retorque this one, just to make sure that it is fully seated, because it does seat itself, and it could even potentially stretch a little bit over time. Not in a bad way, in a good way. Let's clean off the grease that's here. I'll clean it off with brake parts cleaner once this is mounted, but I just want to get off the majority of it while I can. There we go. Lug stud installed. Now let's take the hub assembly with the bearings, slide it all on. There we go. Work that grease in a little bit and press it over all the way in. In order to ensure that it's seated, try to pull it back out. It shouldn't come off very easily. For me, it took a little bit of force. There we go. Everything feels nice and smooth. Now let's put this locking ring on, which is also what secures your bearings and the hub and everything. I'm just going to use this pick to drive it in. Makes it a little faster. And now, at this point, you would want a special tool. It looks like this. That drops right down into these slots, and you use this to turn it. You want to torque this to 52 foot-pounds. Once it's tight, see if you can move the bearing around a little bit. If it's too tight, that's normal, because then you have to back it off and move the bearing, or turn the hub with it backed off a little bit so that you can seat those bearings in. And then the final adjustment should just be finger tight. Like, you should tighten it until you can just stop turning it with your fingers, and that's it. These should not be torqued down, otherwise you will crush the bearings and ruin them very, very fast. Okay, so I used my tool, made this pretty tight, and it's pretty hard to turn this bearing now, or the hub, and that's normal. But you do want to try and turn it a few times, and that'll seat the bearings properly. Typically you'd want to go the other direction. There we go. And it should get very slightly looser. The nut shouldn't back off, but turning it should be a little bit easier. So at this point, we want to use our tool, back this off until it is loose, and then we'll tighten it finger tight. All right, so I loosened it up with my tool. I just snugged it up a little so that I can kind of gauge the tightness of it. And this is now loose enough to where I can literally spin it freely with my pick. So I'm just going to take my fingers, and basically you just want to go until the first hole lines up. That's that one over there. So do this, and at this point you have this little locking pin in here, which is essential. This is what's going to prevent this from backing off. And then, of course, to lock the locking pin in, you use the snap ring. I have a little pick to help drive this on all the way. Just find a thread that it wants to sit on, and just follow that thread all around. Make sure it is fully seated. Okay, that looks good. Give this a spin.
spins easily, that's perfect. So ideally you would want to put a gasket here. I'm pretty sure usually it's a paper gasket. I don't have one. You can use RTV, but you just want to make sure you use very, very little, very thin layer. I'm going to put some on here in between the bolt holes, and then I'll use my clean glove. You don't want an oily glove, that defeats the purpose of the RTV sticking. And I'm just going to spread it around to make it a nice even coat of RTV. Again, if you put too much, well, it's going to squish out, get in the middle there, and it's just not going to be great. Might not even make a very good seal. So I'm just going to go around everywhere and apply it evenly, and then we will put the axle in. And before I tighten these bolts, because I'm using RTV, usually you can just snug them right up and torque them to spec. But because I'm using this gasket maker, I want to wait for it to harden a little bit before I actually do the full torque. So you'll see me putting the bolts in, bottoming them out, and maybe giving them a little snug, but then I won't torque them. I'm going to wait about half an hour before the RTV sets in, dries up a little bit, and then I will go to the full torque spec. At this point, you want to make sure that your axle shaft is clean, free of debris. Of course, I cleaned up this surface here too, and it is ready to be installed. Slide it through, support it as you slide it in. And over here, you'll have to kind of find where the hole is in the differential. Oh, there we go. And at this point, there we go. You want to be gentle on the last step because you don't want to push all the gears inside and kind of dislodge them. Okay, let's get some bolts in here. Line up your bolt holes, start in your bolts. I'm going to start this one on all the way, that way it'll hold the axle into place. Start this one on all the way, and once two are in completely, then basically everything else will line up just fine. So let's get them all in. If your threads are dirty, go ahead and clean them up. I cleaned some of them up because they were a little bit dirty with the old gasket on them, and someone had already put some RTV on here. All right, let's give these a quick snug, and then I will wait, like I said, to fully torque it. So snugging these up, I'm going to go in a cross pattern, and I'm holding my ratchet by the head of the ratchet, so I'm not applying a lot of torque. And the reason I'm going in a cross pattern is to fully seat the RTV evenly. Even if you're using a pre-made gasket, it's good to go in a cross pattern to squish it down evenly. So I'm going to leave it like this for 20 minutes, half an hour. Then I'll come back and do a full pass with the torque wrench all around. So it's been about half an hour, and I want to torque these. If you have the 10.5 rear end, then you want to torque them to 115 foot-pounds. If you have the 11.5 rear end, you want to torque them to 136 foot-pounds. So pick your appropriate torque spec depending on your application. And like I said, I'm going to go in a cross pattern. I'm going to hold the hub with a pry bar. That's all of them. I'm going to go around in a circle, just double check them. Okay, they're all tight. Now I want to clean up the hub surface where the rotor mounts on. It's basically rust-free completely. I just want to clean off the remaining potential grease here with some brake parts cleaner. I'm going to clean off the studs too. I noticed some of them have grease on them, which they're not supposed to. All right, and then I'll just coat it with some AntiSeize. That way it doesn't rust in the future. Put some AntiSeize here, just a thin layer. I'm going to spread it out, but I just want to apply some everywhere, and then I'll just go around. Try not to get it on the lug studs if possible, and try to get it on this ridge right here on the hub part where the rotor sits, because a lot of times it will seize up on there. If it's going to seize up anywhere, it's most likely going to be right there on that ridge.
Let's take our rotor, slide it on. I do want to mention, if you have a lot of rust buildup inside there where it mounts onto the hub, you want to go ahead and clean that off. Mine is in pretty good condition, so I'm not worried about it. So I'm going to slide this on all the way. Let's put on the caliper bracket, line it up with the 2 bolt holes, and slide in the bolts. There's one. Let's bottom these out, and then we'll torque them to 122 foot-pounds. That's one. If you wanted to put anything on these bolts, you should put thread locker, definitely not AntiSeize or grease, just as a side note. And that's 2. Let's get the pads in. If for some reason your pads are having a hard time sliding in, it's probably because you have rust buildup in there, in which case you'd have to just clean it up with a wire brush or sand it down or whatever, and make sure you put some grease in there if needed. Do the same with the sliders. My sliders are good, but if they need to be greased up, go ahead and do that. Now take your caliper, slide it over the pads and over the bracket. Make sure it all lines up. The slider pins have like a straight cutout here that basically lines up with the flat part on the caliper. Grab your 2 mounting bolts. Slide those in, bottom them out, and then torque them to 80 foot-pounds. Okay, if your slider spins like this, you can grab it with some pliers and hold it still. That's 1. And that's 2. Perfect. Let's put the wheel back on. Put all your lug nuts on, bottom them out, and then torque them to 140 foot-pounds. All right, just double check them all one more time. Don't forget about this cover if you have one. Again, 22mm socket, just like we did to take it off, except for this one. Don't use an impact gun or anything like that on it, because these plastic inserts, they strip out really fast and then they won't grip, and then your cover is going to go flying down the road. So just do these by hand, make them nice and snug, and you should be all set.